All right, we will take it away. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for this lunch and learn that we're holding on a pandemic recovery that leaves no one behind. I'm joined today by Alex Hemingway from the CCPA, and I'm Todd Smith, President of the Vancouver District Area Council. Before we get rolling though, I would like to open this with acknowledging that I'm joining this virtual event from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And at this time, I would invite you to also reflect upon the territories of which you're on joining this event from. So a little bit about Alex. Alex Hemingway is a senior economist and public finance policy analyst at the CCPA's BC office. The CCPA is a Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. His research focuses on tax fairness, public finances, public services, and economic inequality in BC and Canada. Alex holds a PhD in political science from UBC, where his research examined the relationship between economic class and political inequality in the advanced industrialized world. He holds 2 master's degrees from the London School of Economics, one in social policy and planning, and the other in global politics, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in psychology from SFU. So throughout this discussion we're having, I'm going to encourage the viewers joining us to put their comments and questions into the chat box. There may be opportunities for you to ask questions yourself on video, but just please note that this session is being recorded and it will be shared online. So we're going to open with a quick poll here, and the question we're going to ask is, are you a public service worker? So we'll open that poll up. And after you voted, if you don't mind and if you're comfortable doing so, just put in the chat box there a bit about what you do for work. So we see the poll results there. So 86% of us on the call today are public service workers and 14% are not. All right, so let's get right into this then. Our first discussion point is why are public services important to recovery that leaves no one behind? Alex, what are your thoughts?
Better unmute myself. Someone's got to do that every meeting. Yeah, I think, this is something on all of our minds coming out of the pandemic, which, well, not coming out of it, but sort of in the late phase of it, hopefully. And all the light that's shone on the importance of public services and getting us through this time, but also from an economic perspective, we have this huge backlog of need for investment in public services in this country here in BC. And, when we think of some of the big affordability challenges that so many people are facing, it's kind of coming up in the election as well. Some of those biggest challenges are in areas like, the housing crisis, in childcare, in also addressing healthcare policy and reinvesting in our public health infrastructure. That's on all of our minds the last year and a half. We know we're facing down the barrel of the climate change crisis, and in each of those areas, we need increased public investment, increase the capacity of our public services to get through. Just to give a couple of examples, on the housing side of the equation, we had for a couple of decades, both the federal and provincial governments largely drop out of investment in affordable housing, and that's had a big impact on the housing crisis we face today. I mean, there's certainly more to it than that, but that's a big piece. So we need public investment to address that. We see universal childcare on the table in this election, which is, that's another area where we've left this critical area of social service to the market, and that's failed to provide this service at adequate levels. There's not enough of it, not enough childcare, and it's too expensive. we need public investment to step in. And further down the list, but in each of these cases, there's a big economic payoff to making these public investments. We know in the case of childcare, for example, and there's detailed research on this, some of it focused on Quebec's public childcare system, that shows that this public investment largely pays for itself because in large part because it increases the ability of particularly women to better participate in the labor force. That increases tax revenues. So, we're shooting ourselves in the foot every year. We let pass by that we don't make that type of investment. It's similar for housing. It's a big drag on household budgets, but it's also a drag on businesses trying to recruit workers. And there's a whole bigger picture here that I think maybe we'll touch on later relating to inequality. Inequality itself, and there's growing evidence, not just from the CCPA, but from relatively conservative institutions like the IMF, the OECD, that says that the levels of extreme economic inequality we see in this country are a drag on economic growth. They're not just wrong, but they also mean that we're poorer than we would be if we had a more equal society. So I don't know, those are a few initial thoughts.
Thanks, Alex. And on your points about the importance of public services, I think it's also important that we reflect on how quickly public servants were able to step in and help out at the onset of the pandemic. Our public service workers, many of whom are PSAC members, processed nearly 4 million CERB applications in the first 5 days and have continued to be here with us along our side throughout the pandemic, aiding Canadians and providing the essential supports that we all need. So, in discussion with the public services here, it's also important that we ensure that, however we proceed through this pandemic and recover from it, that we keep privatization out of that equation. We want these public services to be in-house and delivered by public servants. Are you able to kind of maybe touch on that for us and talk about some of the benefits of that?
Yeah, I mean, one example that comes to mind just to start with, and I'm not an expert on public health, but given the situation we've been in this pandemic, is how important it is to build up the capacity of our public health agencies and of our ability to do things like produce vaccines in this country. We used to have this wonderful public sector research agency and producer of vaccines, Connaught Labs, that was privatized. And I think that's something to keep our eye on going forward. We've seen many promises for reinvesting in vaccine production capacity. I haven't poured over the details of those, but I think there's certainly a danger of those taking the form of subsidies to private industry rather than building up a long-term public sector capacity. Beyond that, I mean, in areas that where I've done a little bit more work, one that comes to mind is related in terms of the provision of primary healthcare in BC. First of all, just in the bigger picture, when you look at Canada's healthcare system and our public healthcare system, and you look at the aspects of it that are currently publicly covered and the aspects of the system that have remained private, that we haven't brought under the public system yet. That's so, for example, familiar example is that we don't have universal pharmacare coverage in this country. We don't have dental care. And actually a big part of our primary care system, doctors' offices and so on, operate as small businesses. And now that we're seeing a transition to more team-based healthcare in BC, like the urgent primary care centers, that's another area to sort of keep an eye on it and keep vigilant about, because we're seeing the expansion of corporate providers of healthcare really wanting to get into this arena of running big clinics. And we've seen kind of public-private partnership type arrangements with the urgent primary care centers that are being rolled out in BC in certain cases. A bunch of them are public, a couple of them are going to be run so far by by private corporations. That's really worrying, not only because it's less efficient and it's less, it's concerning to bring private for-profit provision into our healthcare system, but also it's a foothold for a lobby that is going to establish itself in BC and try and expand its foothold in our healthcare system. Corporate money always looking for new terrain to make profits, and healthcare is a massive section of our economy that they haven't been able to get into as much as they would like. Anyway, but I guess just to bring it back around, my biggest takeaway is that, when we bring services under the public fold, just take pharmacare as an example. All the research shows that providing universal public pharmacare would reduce the overall cost of prescription drugs in the country. So we're wasting money by leaving this to the private sector. And so, this is one of these cases where there's a real disconnect between what public policy tells us, what public opinion would like, which is free access to pharmaceutical drugs, and where the corporate lobby is still really wielding its influence to pursue that privatization agenda that you're talking about. Sorry, I'm kind of going on. I could go on for.
No. It's very interesting
topic.
And I think there's also another piece to this as well, as the end effects on workers who deliver those services. Under private models, you have corporations who are seeking whatever possibility to save a dime here and there and cut corners, and that can often result in precarious employment, short contracts, lower wages, and all of these pieces. Which, as public service workers ourselves, we understand the value of these good jobs that bring this money into our communities, right? So on that, I guess, let's move along. We've talked about some of the things we'd like to see investments in.
Can I just chime in with one before we move on from that one? Just one good news story, because I feel like I'm being a bit negative here, which is that, in BC, they're bringing, people may have heard, they're bringing back in-house under public services a bunch of the support staff in healthcare in our hospitals that were privatized back 20 years ago, which is really wonderful news, undervalued workers. And it's just a shame that that was allowed to happen for so long.
That's a very good point, Alex. Thanks for that. I personally know someone who's in janitorial at a hospital, and I'm looking forward to having a chat with her about this going forward, because I know that's going to make a big difference in our healthcare system and for our communities. And it's good that we have a government that's, provincially anyways, heading in that direction for us. So we've talked about kind of some of the areas we'd like to see investments in public services and the importance of it, especially, in the lens of this pandemic. But how are we going to pay for these? So I would like to open up another poll question for us. And this question is, have you heard about the idea of a wealth tax on the rich? And we'll just give it a second. All right, everyone's heard of this. That's fantastic. This will make the discussion even more interesting. That's good. So how would we pay for these services? What would a wealth tax look like? What would you like to see in a wealth tax, Alex?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways we can pay for the type of investment we need, but to focus on the wealth tax piece, which I think could be a big component of it. First of all, just to take a step back, I mean, I think it's fascinating to see over the past decade or so how big a shift there's been in which really deep concern about inequality has become entirely mainstream. And you see this with wealth tax. You look at the polling on this, and this idea has been bubbling up more the past few years, and I think people are seeing that who are on this call familiar with it. Out of the US, out of Europe, a lot of discussion about wealth tax. And you look at the polling in Canada, this is both pre-pandemic and right now. You have massive public support for a wealth tax focused on the super rich. The latest poll I saw was 89% support among Canadians. And it's something that actually unites people as well. I think we're struggle with some some of the divisiveness in our politics maybe spilling over from the US lately. This is something that unites people. 83% of conservative voters favor a wealth tax as well. And so we're seeing this on the table in the federal election right now. And I and CCPA have been publishing research on wealth tax over the past few years. So I think folks on this call may be familiar that on the federal NDP has proposed a 1% annual tax on the wealth of those with $10 million of wealth or more. Actually only applies to that portion of wealth above 10 million. So if you have $10 million, you don't pay $1 in the tax, but you pay 1% on the 10 million and first dollar. And now the Greens jumped on that bandwagon as well. They've been backing this policy, but a smaller version of it, theirs would kick in at $20 million. Actually, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the platforms later, so I'll maybe hold off on that. But all to say that this could raise a huge amount of revenue federally. So we've published some estimates of this. The Parliamentary Budget Office has published its own estimates. It's actually lowballing the potential revenue when you compare their approach to modeling all this, all the economics behind it. They're not using the most up-to-date international research on wealth tax from economists specializing in this. So we've been trying to correct for that. So our estimate shows that, so PBO is saying the NDP's version of wealth tax would raise $10 billion per year. Our estimates say $16 billion. And what we've also been trying to put on the table is, that even that 1% tax is fairly timid, especially compared to some of the proposals we saw south of the border from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, where they're talking about wealth tax rates that would increase up to as high as 6 and 8% on multi-billionaires. So there's a lot of room to go further. So what we did is we actually modeled a sort of a moderate wealth tax that would have rates that go as high as 3% on wealth over $100 million. And what we found is, and actually this is a sneak preview, we're going to publish this research tomorrow or Monday. It's just been wrapping it up this week. Over a 10-year window, that moderate wealth tax would raise over $250 billion in revenue, $343 billion. And our approach to this has been vetted by economists like Gabriel Zuckman down at University of California, Berkeley, who's done some of the costing and scoring analysis for the Sanders and Warren wealth taxes. And so, it's big money. And so one of the criticisms of wealth tax among the punditry, at least, it's incredibly popular among the public, as we're talking about, has been that, oh, well, it wouldn't really raise that much money after all, and based on some cherry picking of previous estimates. So, we're aiming to really demonstrate that that's not true whatsoever.
Thanks, Alex. I did get a question in the chat here directly to myself. And someone's just wondering, with regards to the wealth tax, how do capital gains factor into this? Is there any consideration on corporate taxation? So I guess maybe it's a little bit about what a wealth tax would capture.
Yeah. And so this type of annual, I'll come back to the capital gains thing in a moment, because that's another area ripe for reform and raising revenue. In terms of this annual wealth tax itself, really what it's doing, and I should have said this from the outset, is it's taxing your total net wealth. So your total assets, all the stocks, real estate that these very wealthy households own, minus any debt that they may hold. So it's your net wealth. So if they've got big debt, that's sort of subtracted out from that net total there. So that's a new approach. That would be a new approach to taxation in Canada, taxing that stock of wealth that you hold and focusing at the very richest end of the spectrum. Actually, when you look at a wealth tax over $10 million, if you're in the richest 1% in Canada, you're not rich enough to be captured by this. You have to be in the richest 0.5% to be captured by this wealth tax. Now, coming back to capital gains, we do have a capital gains tax in Canada, but one of the problems with it is that currently income that you get from owning capital, those capital gains that you're referring to, is taxed at only half the rate that income from labor, from doing work, is taxed at. So essentially, the way it works is only 50% of capital gains are considered to be taxable in the first place, and then you apply the tax rates. Is a very small portion of it that actually gets taxed. So that's also on the table in the elections, the idea of removing that special treatment to capital gains and equalizing it so that income from work and income from capital gains are taxed at the same rate. If we equalize it, that would raise about $8 billion per year in revenue. So that's another big one, and one that we've been calling for as well, and that's in some of the platforms.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So I think many of us would agree that the super wealthy and the rich will do almost anything to not part with their money. So how could you see this tax functioning? Like how would the government be able to collect this money?
Yeah, so there are examples of wealth taxes that continue to exist in Europe, and some older ones that have been phased out. So it's not entirely new terrain in terms of levying a tax. But the big difference between those older European wealth taxes and what's being proposed today in Canada, in the US, and in other countries is that focus on the super rich. So some of the older European wealth taxes sort of captured the upper middle income folks as well. They might kick in at wealth of, say, 500,000 euros or something like that. So affluent people. But anyway, that's all to say that there is experience in levying these types of taxes. We actually have a lot of the information. Canada Revenue Agency will already have a lot of the information that it needs to levy significant parts of that tax. So the ultra rich, a lot of their wealth takes the form of stocks and other forms of financial wealth that is captured in that small way by the existing capital gains tax. So that information, a lot of that information is already being shared by financial institutions and being reported by taxpayers. And one of the things that the wealth tax economics research tells us that's really been exploding over the past few years is that a lot of the tax avoidance and evasion that we see under the existing tax system, and that is talked about sometimes in relation to wealth taxing, it would just be avoided or evaded. A lot of that tax evasion behavior is a result of policy choices. It's something that we could actually change with additional enforcement and some tweaks in policy, increasing the reporting requirements for financial institutions, both domestically and any financial institutions that do business with Canada. And so this is actually well understood, and it's being openly acknowledged in a way that it hasn't been in many years. And one of the ways you can see this is the Parliamentary Budget Office has been doing analysis on different party proposals to put more money into Canada Revenue Agency, put more money into enforcement, even in the existing tax system. And basically what they're finding is that for each dollar you put into enforcement, you can expect about $5 or $6 in revenue back. So we've been leaving all of this money on the table in our existing tax system, and particularly among those ultra rich, by not adequately funding that enforcement side of things. So essentially, the shorter version of it is, if there is the political will to take on the super rich, there is the technical and economic capacity to implement a wealth tax.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, that was a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much. And we see this gap between the rich and everyone else, us, aka growing wider and wider. So it's certainly time for the rich, the ultra rich and whatnot, to start paying their fair share for everyone to have a just future. So do you have any other closing remarks, Alex, before we move on to our next section?
Well, some of these numbers I think are getting really familiar to folks, but I'm realizing I haven't even talked about the level of inequality we observe in the country today. So maybe I'll just give a few quick, I think, most interesting numbers around that, which is, in research that we published before the pandemic, you could see that the average of Canadian billionaires owned and controlled about 4,500 times as much wealth as the typical Canadian family. If you took just the richest 87 families in the country, they controlled more wealth than the bottom 12 million Canadians combined. And we also see that these wealth inequality extremes coming out in analysis from the Parliamentary Budget Office, from academic researchers. The 1% now control between about 26 to 29% of all the wealth in the country, and that's increased over the past few decades, won't surprise you. And even during the pandemic, and this is work that we've published, the Canadian billionaires saw their wealth increase by $78 billion just in the first year of the pandemic alone. Well, so many people were suffering. So that, the extremes are there, and I'm it's good to put that marker down, but I'm glad. It's great that we're sort of getting to the point where the discussion is not just, is this a problem, are we concerned about it, but actually what can we do about it? So yeah.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, we've heard that the vast majority of Canadians support this wealth tax. So now our next section is going to be kind of quickly looking at where the major federal parties sit on a wealth tax. So the Conservative Party of Canada, they do not promise a wealth tax or an increase in the upper tax brackets. They are looking to increase funding for enforcement against tax evasion, though. The Liberal Party of Canada will raise tax rates by 3% only for the largest and most profitable banks and insurance companies, and develop targeted anti-avoidance rules for tax evaders. The New Democratic Party of Canada will increase the top tax rate and corporate tax rate, implement an excess profits tax and an unspecified wealth tax, as well as close loopholes and boost funding for compliance and enforcement. The Green Party will create a 1% tax on wealth above $20 million and a new tax on luxury goods, as well as close tax loopholes and crack down on offshore tax evasion, and provide adequate funding to the Canada Revenue Agency to do that collection work. The PSAC is going to be releasing a full platform analysis. It'll be available on the PSAC website this Friday, so tomorrow, if you'd like to take a look. Yeah, so thank you again today, Alex, for this really nice discussion. We kind of talked about, our current economic situation in the pandemic, the value of our public services and why we all depend on them and how they create a more fair and equitable society and how we can strengthen those and go forward. And, we're going to be at that ballot box on or before September 20th. So I think we all should be taking this to consideration when we make that choice. As well as next week, we have 2 more of these Lunch and Learn events taking place. On September 14th, which is Tuesday, we have Why is a Strong Public Healthcare System Critical to a Pandemic Recovery? And this will be with Audrey Ann Guay of the BC Health Coalition and Patty Ducharme of the PSAC Vancouver Regional Office. And they'll be talking about how the government can safeguard and improve Canadians' health as we move forward from COVID. And then on Wednesday, also at noon, we have Why is Childcare Central to Canada's Pandemic Recovery? And this is with Sharon Gregson from the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC and Nyellen Chand from the PSAC West Fraser Valley Area Council President to hear about how the lack of affordable and accessible childcare impacted Canadians' families during the pandemic, the economic and social benefits of strong national childcare program, and how childcare will be central to Canada's recovery. So again, thank you so much for your time today, Alex. Do you have any closing remarks or thoughts for us before we close this off?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. Just thinking about the platform plank that you mentioned, and we were talking about this before as well. I mean, there is a range of good ideas mixed in there, and I think it's always worth paying attention to the dollar signs and how much they would actually raise. And so, I think additional taxes on large banks are a good thing, and that's in the Liberal platform. The NDP is saying we'll raise the overall corporate tax rate, which should affect all the large corporations. I think that's better. But the point I was going to make is, the wealth tax alone would raise. I'd have to double check. I don't have the number right in front of me, but it would raise significantly more, maybe about double as much revenue as all of the provisions in the Liberal platform combined, just to give one example. So I think we should take an all of the above approach, take all the good ideas we can get, but also we need to, pay attention to the actual numbers versus the symbolism, because I think everyone, a lot of folks in the selection field, they need to tap into the anger at the super rich, and then we got to follow the thread to, what the specific policies they're proposing are actually going to accomplish. And then I was going to mention, if folks are interested in seeing that new wealth tax analysis that I mentioned and sort of sneak previewed, that should be coming out tomorrow or next week, they can find it at policynote.ca, and I'll just stick that in the chat for those who are here. And if you don't mind me doing this, also for those who aren't already getting emails from CCPA, here's a link to sign up for them if you want to follow the work out of our BC office. I always forget to do this, but I actually remembered today. And yeah, it's pretty sparing. I think they only send them like twice a month. So yeah, and just, yeah, thanks for having me. And I mean, I guess sorry, I'm going on a bit, but the one last comment I'll just make it, and a topic we didn't come around to, is that in making any of these changes happen in a sustainable way, we need social movement power to overcome the lobbying power of these large corporations. I mean, that's how you have policies that have 90% support but aren't enacted, is that the corporate lobby is very powerful. We can counteract them, and union and trade union membership is so crucial to that. So I always, I just appreciate being invited to be among union members. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Alex. You're always a pleasure to have at our events, and you're a strong ally of all workers. And thank you for your work and your thoughts today. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I guess we'll close up this session. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and hopefully you can make the ones next week on Tuesday and Wednesday. Take care.